The wind in the high plains of the Dakota Territory carried the memory of winter, a final, sharp tooth in the jaw of spring. It was a lonely sound, the only companion Winona had known for 5 seasons. It whipped through the sparse pines and scoured the granite faces of the hills, speaking a language of solitude she had come to understand as her own. In the year of 1884, the world had shrunk to the size of this rocky, forgotten patch of land, and her life had become a rhythm of survival, as steady and stark as a heartbeat in the immense silence. She moved through the undergrowth with a quietness that was less a skill and more a state of being. Her feet, clad in worn moccasins, knew the language of every twig and stone. She was checking her snares, her gaze sweeping the familiar landscape, noting the faintest disturbances, the track of a coyote, the nervous flight of a sparrow. It was then that she saw it. A disruption not made by any creature she knew, a darkness against the pale sky that did not belong. It was a shape hanging from the thickest branch of a cottonwood that stood defiant in a shallow ravine. Her breath caught, a small, sharp snag in her chest. For a long moment, she remained perfectly still, melting back into the shadows of the pines. Her first instinct, honed by years of loss and flight, was to turn and disappear. Whatever trouble hung from that tree was the trouble of the white man, and their trouble was a plague she had learned to avoid at all costs. It had already taken everything from her, her family, her people, her place in the world. But she did not leave. Something held her rooted to the spot, a grim curiosity, perhaps, or the ghost of a compassion she thought had long since died. The wind turned the hanging shape slowly, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of a man. He was suspended not by the neck, but by his hands, which were bound together and thrown over the branch. His head lolled forward, a dead weight on his chest. From this distance he appeared to be gone, another piece of grim refuse left to the scavengers of the plains. Against her better judgment, she began to move closer, her approach as cautious as a doe nearing a salt lick. The scent of fear and sweat reached her first, a sour tang on the cold air. Then she saw the raw, chafed flesh of his wrists, the dark lines of dried blood tracking down his arms. His boots were gone, his feet bare and bruised. His shirt had been ripped from him, leaving his torso exposed to the biting wind. And then she saw the brand. Seared across the pale skin of his chest, in ugly, weeping letters, were 2 words: Indian lover. The letters were a crude mockery of print, a declaration of hate burned into flesh. The sight of it struck a dissonant chord deep inside her. It was a brand of shame, a punishment meant to mark and ostracize. It was a violence she understood intimately, for she wore her own version of it not on her skin, but in the marrow of her bones, in the solitude that had become her life. This man, this stranger, had been condemned for a crime that tied his fate, however violently, to her people. She reached the base of the tree and looked up at him. His face was obscured by a tangle of sweat-dampened brown hair. A low groan, so faint it was nearly stolen by the wind, escaped his lips. He was alive. The knowledge landed in her stomach like a stone. Leaving a dead man to the crows was one thing. Leaving a living one to suffer the same fate was another. It was a choice she did not want. Her peaceful, empty world was a fragile thing, built on the principle of non-interference. This man was a breach, a gaping wound in the fabric of her isolation. Her jaw tightened. She looked at the raw, brutal letters on his chest again. The men who did this were white men. They hated him for the same reason they hated her. A strange, bitter kinship formed in that moment, thin as a spider's thread, but undeniably there. He was an enemy of her enemies. It was not kindness that moved her then, but a cold, hard logic of survival. Perhaps it was a defiance she had forgotten she possessed. To leave him here would be to let those men win. To save him was to spit in their eye, a silent act of rebellion in a world that had silenced her. She drew the knife from the sheath at her belt. The blade was worn but sharp, its edge maintained with meticulous care. Reaching up, she began to saw at the thick rope binding his wrists. It was slow, arduous work, His dead weight pulled the rope taut, making each stroke of the knife a struggle. His body swayed with her efforts, and another pained murmur slipped from his throat. Finally, with a loud snap, the rope gave way. He collapsed in a heap at the foot of the tree, a disjointed tangle of limbs. He did not move. For a terrifying second, she thought the fall had finished him. She knelt, placing 2 fingers against the side of his neck. A pulse, faint and thready, beat against her skin. It was a stubborn flicker of life in the overwhelming dark. Winona looked around at the vast, empty landscape. She was alone with this broken man, this branded outcast. Dragging him back to her sheltera, small hidden dugout she had fortified against the elements, was a monumental risk. If the men who did this returned, they would find them both. But the alternative was to leave him here, a meal for the wolves that would begin to sing their chilling songs as dusk fell. She looked down at his face, pushing the matted hair away from his forehead. He was younger than she had first thought, his features drawn and pale beneath a layer of dirt and blood. There were lines of hardship around his eyes, but not the cruel hardness she saw in the faces of the men who passed through the trading posts. She saw only suffering. With a sigh that seemed to pull up the last of her reserves, she made her decision. She could not leave him. Whatever his story, whatever the consequences, his fate was now entwined with hers. She grabbed him under the arms, the muscles in her back and shoulders straining, and began the slow, grueling task of dragging him away from the shadow of the cottonwood tree and toward the fragile sanctuary she called home. The silence of the plains was broken only by the sound of his body scraping against the unforgiving earth. The shelter was little more than a den, dug into the side of a hill and reinforced with scavenged timber and packed earth. A thick hide served as a door, and a small, carefully vented fire pit in the center provided the only warmth. It smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the damp scent of the earth itself. It was her entire world, and bringing the stranger into it felt like a profanation, a violation of a sacred, lonely space. She laid him on her own sleeping pallet of furs near the fire pit. His breath was shallow, his skin cold to the touch. For the next several hours, she worked with a detached, methodical focus, pushing aside the turmoil in her mind. She cleaned the angry, weeping brand with a decoction of yarrow to stave off infection, her touch gentle despite the revulsion the wound inspired. It was a mark of profound cruelty, a story of pain she could read all too well. She forced sips of lukewarm water between his cracked lips and covered him with every spare blanket and hide she owned. Paced sections, his unconsciousness was a kind of mercy. It allowed her to tend to him without the complication of words, without having to face the man attached to the body. He was simply a task, a problem to be solved. But as the night deepened and the fire cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls, the silence began to feel different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of another person's breathing, a fragile rhythm that altered the very character of her solitude. He drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. During his brief, fevered moments of awareness, his eyes, startling, pale blue, would fix on her with a dazed confusion, sometimes with a flash of fear. He spoke only in broken murmurs, fragments of words that made no sense. "Water," he rasped once, his voice a dry whisper. She gave it to him, cold. He shivered, though he was wrapped in thick furs. She added more wood to the fire. On the 3rd morning, she awoke to find him watching her. The fever had broken, and the confusion in his eyes had been replaced by a wary, searching intelligence. He had pushed himself up slightly on one elbow, his gaze fixed on her as she sat across the small space, mending a tear in a rabbit-skin glove. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. "Where?" he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "My home," she said, her voice quiet, unused to conversation. She did not offer more. He looked around the small dugout, taking in the earthen walls, the neatly stacked firewood, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. His gaze fell to his own chest, where her poultice of herbs covered the brand. He winced, a flicker of pain and shame crossing his features. You cut me down," he stated, more to himself than to her. Winona merely nodded, her fingers never ceasing their work with the needle and sinew. She would not make this easy for him. She had saved his life, but that did not make him a friend. He was still a white man, an unknown quantity, a source of potential danger. "Why?" he asked, the word raw. She paused her sewing and finally met his eyes. Her own gaze was dark and unreadable. "The men who did that," she said, her voice flat, "I do not like them." It was the simplest truth, and yet it seemed to satisfy him. He sank back down onto the furs, a deep sigh shuddering through his body. He was too weak to press for more. They fell back into silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of two people in a shared space, aware of each other in a way that was both uncomfortable and unavoidable. His name, she learned, was Isaac Callahan. He offered it a day later, in a quiet, halting exchange. He did not offer his story, and she did not ask for it. The brand on his chest spoke loudly enough. It told a tale of forbidden connection, of crossing boundaries that his world and hers deemed inviolable. She wondered about the woman. Was she Lakota? Cheyenne? Had he loved her? Was she the reason he was hanging from that tree? The questions hovered in the small space between them, unanswered. As Isaac slowly regained his strength, a new, awkward routine established itself. He was weak, but not idle. He would insist on helping, his movements slow and deliberate. He would feed the fire, his hands clumsy with the tongs she had fashioned from green wood. He would try to clean the bowls she used for their sparse meals of rabbit stew and root vegetables, his pride refusing to let him be a complete burden. Winona watched him, her suspicion warring with a grudging respect. He did not carry the arrogance she associated with white men. There was a quiet humility about him, a deep-seated sorrow in his eyes that she recognized. It was the look of someone who had lost everything. He never complained about the meager food or the cramped, dark shelter. He accepted what she offered with a quiet "thank you" that seemed to hold a world of gratitude. One evening, as a late spring snowstorm raged outside, trapping them in the dugout, he spoke without being prompted. The wind howled like a grieving animal, and the flickering firelight made the small space feel like the last safe place on earth. "Her name was Soteo," he said, his voice low and rough. He was staring into the flames, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of herbal tea. Winona looked up from the basket she was weaving. She remained silent, giving him the space to continue or not. "She was Cheyenne," he went on, his gaze distant. "She taught me the names of the stars, said they were a map for the spirits. I worked on the Vance Ranch, north of here. Her people were camped nearby for the winter." A shadow passed over his face, deep and painful. "Mr. Vance, he and his sons, they don't believe in mixing." He didn't need to say more. Winona could piece together the rest of the grim story. A stolen courtship, a discovery, the rage of men who saw the world in black and white, in settler and savage. "Is she?" Winona began, her voice softer than she intended. Isaac shook his head, a single, sharp gesture of negation. "They drove her people off, burned their camp, told me they killed her. I don't know if it's true. I fought them. Fought them hard." He touched his chest, a phantom pain flickering in his eyes. "This was their answer. They wanted me to die slow, a warning to any other man who forgot his place." The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Winona felt a shift inside her. The abstract story burned onto his skin now had a name, a face, a history. It was a story of love and hate, a story that mirrored her own losses in ways that were both different and painfully the same. She, too, had lost her family to the unreasoning hatred of men like Vance. She reached out and placed a small piece of dried fruit on the flat stone beside him. It was a simple gesture, a wordless offering of comfort. He looked at it, then up at her, and in his pale blue eyes, she saw a flicker of something beyond gratitude. It was understanding. He saw her, truly saw her, not as an Indian, but as a person who understood his grief. The snowstorm lasted for 3 days. In the enforced intimacy of the shelter, the walls of suspicion began to crumble, worn down by shared silence and small, necessary acts of cooperation. He told her about his life before, a farm back east, a family lost to sickness, a westward journey in search of a new beginning that had led him here. She, in turn, found herself speaking of things she had not spoken of in years. She told him about her younger brother, who had loved to track rabbits, and the lullabies her mother used to sing. She did not speak of the soldiers or the fire or the long, desperate journey that had brought her to this lonely hill. But she gave him pieces of the life that had existed before the silence. They were two people from warring worlds, pushed together by violence and circumstance, and in the heart of that desolation, a fragile seed of connection had taken root. The brand on his chest was no longer just a symbol of his past transgression, it was the scar that had led him to her door. And for the first time in a very long time, Winona did not feel entirely alone. The silence in her home was no longer empty. It held the quiet promise of a shared dawn. The days that followed the storm settled into a new rhythm, one of fragile peace. Isaac, now stronger, took on more of the daily chores. He chopped firewood with a surprising efficiency, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady counterpoint to the whispering wind. He learned to check her snares, his movements becoming less clumsy and more attuned to the quiet language of the wilderness. He never ventured far, always staying within sight of the shelter, a silent acknowledgement of the danger that still lurked beyond their small patch of land. Their conversations remained sparse, but the silences were now comfortable, filled with a shared understanding that needed no words. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, he carving a piece of wood into the shape of a bird, she weaving reeds into a sturdy basket. In these moments, they were not a white man and an Indian woman. They were just Isaac and Winona, two survivors finding a strange sort of solace in each other's company. He had a way of looking at her, a gentleness in his pale eyes that unsettled her. It was a look that saw past the hardened exterior she presented to the world. He saw the woman she had once been, the woman she had forgotten how to be. One afternoon he found her staring at a small beaded pouch she kept tucked away. It was the only thing she had left of her mother. "It's beautiful," he said quietly, sitting down a respectful distance from her. "My mother made it," she replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The pattern is the path of the river near our winter camp. She said as long as I had it, I could always find my way home." A profound sadness settled over her. Home was a place that no longer existed. It was a ghost, a memory. Isaac said nothing for a long moment. Then, very softly, he said, "Maybe home isn't a place you find. Maybe it's something you make." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She looked at him, at his earnest face, and the sorrow that still lingered in his eyes. He understood. He too was unhomed, adrift in a world that had cast him out. In that moment, the last of her defenses crumbled. He was not a threat, he was her kin, not in blood, but in loss. But the world they had built was a fragile bubble, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before it burst. The threat of Vance and his sons was a constant, unspoken shadow at the edge of their awareness. They would not have left a job half-finished. They would be searching, convinced that the wilderness had claimed Isaac's life. But their certainty would not last forever. The first sign of trouble came not as a shout or a gunshot, but as a faint trace on the horizontal plume of dust that did not belong to the wind. Winona saw it from the crest of the hill where she went to gather sage. It was far to the north, in the direction of the Vance ranch. Riders, too many to be a simple patrol. She hurried back to the shelter, her heart a cold knot in her stomach. "They're coming," she said, her voice low and urgent as she pushed through the hide flap. Isaac was instantly on his feet, the piece of wood he was carving falling to the floor, the color drained from his face, replaced by a grim resolve. "How many?" "I saw 4, maybe more." "Vance," he breathed, the name a curse. And his boys. They've come to make sure I'm dead. His gaze met hers, and in it she saw not just fear, but a fierce protectiveness. You have to go, he said. Get away from here. This is my fight, not yours. Winona shook her head, a stubborn fire igniting in her chest. This is my home, she said, the words surprising her with their ferocity. I will not run from it. Not again. Her eyes swept over the small dugout, the place that had been her refuge. Isaac's words from the day before echoed in her mind. Maybe home is something you make. She had made this place. She would not let them destroy it. And you are not strong enough to face them alone, she added, her tone leaving no room for argument. A desperate plan began to form in her mind, born of her intimate knowledge of this land. The terrain itself would be their weapon. The rocky hills, the dense thickets of choker cherry, the treacherous game trails, these were her allies. We will not fight them here, she said, her voice steady and clear. This place is too open. We will lead them into the broken lands to the west. I know a place, a maze of canyons. They will follow. Their anger will make them reckless. Isaac listened, his expression shifting from despair to a flicker of hope. He trusted her. He had seen her strength, her wisdom. He nodded slowly. Tell me what to do. They worked quickly, a seamless team united by a single purpose. They gathered what little they could carry: water skins, dried meat, her knife, his small carving. Winona took a moment to smudge the traces of their fire, to make the shelter look as if it had been abandoned for some time. It was a faint hope, but it was something. Then they moved. Winona led the way, setting a pace that was swift but silent. Isaac followed, his long strides eating up the ground. He was no longer the broken man she had cut down from the tree. There was a strength in his step, a purpose in his eyes. He was fighting not just for his own life now, but for hers, for the fragile peace they had found together. They made for the west, leaving a trail that was just obvious enough for an experienced tracker to follow. It was a lure, a deliberate invitation into her territory. As they ran, the sky began to bruise into the colors of sunset, painting the vast landscape in hues of orange and purple. It was beautiful and terrible, the world seeming to hold its breath before the coming storm. They reached the edge of the broken lands as twilight deepened into night. Before them lay a labyrinth of steep-sided arroyos and shadowy canyons, a place where a man could get lost for days. Winona paused, listening. Far behind them, she could hear the faint, muffled sound of horses' hooves. They had found the trail. They are coming, Isaac said, his hand instinctively going to his chest, to the scarred flesh that had started this all. Let them come, Winona replied, her voice a low whisper in the growing dark. She turned to him, her face illuminated by the last vestiges of daylight. Stay close. Do exactly as I say. The land will protect us. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her dark eyes, and nodded. He owed this woman his life. He would not fail her now. Together, they descended into the shadows of the canyons, vanishing into the embrace of the earth like ghosts. The hunt had begun. The canyons were a world of their own, a confusing network of stone and shadow under the cold light of a sliver moon. Winona moved through the darkness with an assurance that was almost supernatural. She knew every turn, every dead end, every hidden passage. The land was not just a map in her mind, it was a part of her. Isaac followed so closely that he could feel the warmth radiating from her back, trusting her guidance implicitly. Behind them, the sounds of their pursuers grew louder, echoing strangely off the canyon walls. The men were clumsy, their horses skittish in the unfamiliar terrain. Shouted curses and the clatter of dislodged stones announced their progress. They were city men, ranchmen, used to open spaces where power was measured by the speed of a horse and the accuracy of a gun. Here, in the tight, winding corridors of the earth, they were blind and vulnerable. Winona led them on a winding circular path, doubling back on their own trail, drawing the horsemen deeper into the labyrinth. Her plan was not to confront them directly, but to separate them, to use the land to pick them apart one by one. She stopped at a narrow fork in the canyon. "Climb," she whispered to Isaac, pointing to a series of handholds carved into the rock face by centuries of wind and water. "Wait for me at the top of the ridge. Do not make a sound." He hesitated, not wanting to leave her. "Winona." "Go," she insisted, her voice sharp with urgency. "They will see my tracks leading this way. They will follow. You must be gone." He saw the unwavering resolve in her face and did as he was told, scrambling up the rock face with a silent agility he hadn't known he possessed. From the top of the narrow ridge, he peered down, his heart pounding against his ribs. He watched as Winona continued down one fork of the canyon, her solitary figure soon swallowed by the darkness. Minutes later, the first of the riders appeared. It was a large, brutish man Isaac recognized as one of Vance's sons. He dismounted, studying the ground with a lantern. "She went this way." He bellowed back to the others. "The tracks are fresh." He plunged into the canyon after her, his arrogance making him careless. Isaac held his breath. He heard a faint scuffling sound from below, a choked cry, and then silence. A terrible, heavy silence. He waited, his muscles screaming with tension. A few moments later, Winona emerged from the shadows of the canyon fork and began to climb the rock face toward him. Her face was grim, but her eyes were clear. She had not killed the man, he knew instinctively. She had incapacitated him, using a pressure point, a well-aimed blow, something to neutralize the threat without taking a life unless absolutely necessary. They continued this grim dance through the night. Winona would create a diversion, a set of misleading tracks, a sound in the distance, luring another of the men away from the group. She moved like a phantom, using her knowledge of the acoustics of the canyons to throw her voice, to make a single person sound like a group, or to create an eerie silence where there should be noise. Isaac's role was to wait, to watch, to be her silent partner, his presence a steady anchor in the terrifying darkness. Finally, only two men remained, the patriarch, Mr. Vance, and his eldest son, a man whose cruel face was burned into Isaac's memory. They were more cautious now, moving together, their fear making them more dangerous. They found one of their fallen men, groaning and disoriented at the bottom of a ravine, and their rage escalated. "Witch!" Vance roared, his voice echoing through the canyons. "Indian witch! Show yourself! Show us the man you're hiding!" Winona and Isaac were pressed into a narrow crevice high on a canyon wall, the words washing over them. Isaac felt a tremor of rage run through him. He wanted to leap down, to face the man who had ordered him branded, to make him pay for Sotayo, for Winona, for everything. But he felt Winona's hand on his arm, a firm, steadying pressure. Not yet. They had reached the heart of her trap. It was a large, bowl-shaped canyon that the Lakota called the Place of Whispering Winds. The wind funneled through it in a way that created strange, sighing echoes and carried sound for great distances. At one end was a steep, seemingly impassable rock slide. "We go there," Winona whispered, pointing toward the rock slide. "There is a way through, a small tunnel near the base. They will think we are trapped." It was their final gambit. They scrambled down into the bowl of the canyon, making enough noise to be heard. As they had anticipated, Vance and his sons spurred their horses forward, their faces lit with triumphant hate as they saw their prey cornered against the rock slide. "Nowhere left to run, Callahan," Vance shouted, raising his rifle. "We should have cut your throat right at the start. And as for your squaw..." Isaac stepped forward, placing himself in front of Winona. His body was a shield, his posture defiant. The man who had been left to die on a tree was gone. In his place stood someone who had found something to live for, to die for. "Leave her out of this, Vance," Isaac said, his voice ringing with a strength that surprised even himself. "Your quarrel is with me." Vance laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "My quarrel is with anyone who forgets their place. You defiled yourself. She is an animal. You will die together." He aimed his rifle, but as he did, a sound began to build around them. It started as a low rumble and grew into a deafening roar. Isaac looked at Winona, a question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. High above them, on the ridge overlooking the rock slide, a series of precariously balanced boulders, held in place by a single, cleverly cut log, began to shift. Winona had prepared this place long ago, a final defense for her home. All it took was severing one last rope, a task she had completed before they descended. The rock slide began. It was not an avalanche, but a controlled, thundering cascade of rock and scree, pouring down the side of the canyon, not where they stood, but directly in the path of Vance and his son. Cutting off their advance, their horses reared in panic, throwing both men to the ground. Rocks rained down around them, and a massive cloud of dust filled the canyon, choking the air. When the dust began to settle, Vance and his son were trapped on the far side of a massive, impassable wall of rock. Their horses were gone, bolted in terror. They were alive, but they were defeated. Disarmed, unhorsed, and lost deep in a hostile wilderness they did not understand. Their reign of terror was over. Winona grabbed Isaac's hand. "Now," she said. She pulled him toward the hidden opening at the base of the slide. They slipped through the narrow tunnel, emerging on the other side into the cool, clean air of the pre-dawn light. Behind them, they could hear Vance's faint, enraged screams, swallowed by the uncaring stone. They did not look back. They walked eastward, toward the rising sun, their hands still clasped together. The ordeal was over. They had faced the darkness and survived. They had won. They returned to the shelter as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold. The world felt new, washed clean by the violence of the night. The small dugout, once a symbol of her isolation, now felt like a true sanctuary, a place of safety they had earned and defended together. Isaac collapsed onto the furs, his body humming with exhaustion and adrenaline. Winona moved to the fire pit, her hands automatically beginning the familiar motions of rekindling the embers. But this time, the simple domestic act felt different. It was not a chore done for survival, but an affirmation of life, of continuity. He watched her, his heart full of a feeling he could not name. It was more than gratitude, more than respect. In the crucible of the canyons, their separate struggles had fused into a single, shared existence. She had saved his life not once, but twice. She had shown him a courage and wisdom that humbled him. "Winona," he said, his voice quiet in the still morning air. She turned from the fire to look at him. "Thank you," he said. The words were inadequate, a pebble trying to describe a mountain, but they were all he had. She gave a small nod, accepting his gratitude as she had accepted everything else, with a quiet, powerful grace. She came and sat near him, tending to a long scratch on his arm he hadn't even noticed he'd received. Her touch was gentle, her focus absolute. "The Vances will not trouble anyone again," she said softly. "The wilderness will be their prison. If they survive, they will not return." They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, listening to the fire crackle to life. The threat that had hung over them was gone, leaving a vacuum in its place. A question hung in the air, unspoken but potent. What now? The shelter was safe again, but they both knew things had changed irrevocably. Her solitude had been broken forever. His past had been confronted and defeated. They were no longer the same people who had met under the shadow of that cottonwood tree. "I can't stay here," Isaac finally said, the words costing him. "It isn't right. I've brought you nothing but trouble. I'll move on. Head west. California, maybe." He couldn't meet her eyes as he spoke. The thought of leaving felt like tearing something vital from his own chest. Winona was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. "This land is all I have known. To leave is to be a ghost again." "I know," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I am sorry, Winona, for all of it." She finally looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "You said home is something you make," she reminded him gently. The memory of his own words hung between them. He looked around the small, earthen-walled shelter. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the resilience that seemed woven into her very being. He had come here as a broken man, branded and discarded by his own kind. And in this unlikely place, with this unlikely woman, he had been remade. He had found a strength he didn't know he had, a purpose he thought he had lost forever. Leaving would not be a new beginning. It would be a return to the emptiness. "I was wrong," he said softly. "Staying here, it's the only thing that feels right." He hesitated, his heart in his throat. If you'll have me." A slow warmth spread through Winona's chest, a feeling she had thought was lost to her forever. It was hope. For years she had survived, she had endured, but she had not truly lived. With Isaac, in the midst of fear and danger, she had felt more alive than she had in a decade. His presence had not been a disruption to her peace, it had been the end of her loneliness. She reached out and laid her hand over his. Her skin was warm against his. It was an answer more powerful than any word. They did not need to speak of love or promises. Their bond had been forged in shared trauma, tempered in conflict, and sealed in mutual respect. It was a connection that ran deeper than words, a quiet understanding that they belonged together. In the weeks and months that followed, they built a new life in the shadow of the hills. They reinforced the shelter, expanding it, making it a true home. He taught her the clumsy English words for things she had only known in Lakota, and she taught him the secrets of the land, which roots were sweet, which berries were poison, how to read the clouds for signs of rain. The brand on his chest healed, leaving a pale, puckered scar, a permanent reminder of the hatred that had nearly killed him. But it was no longer a mark of shame. It was a map of his journey, the brutal path that had, against all odds, led him to his salvation, to his home. They lived a quiet life, a world unto themselves in the vastness of the plains. Sometimes from the high ridges they would see riders in the distance, but no one ever bothered them again. They were a myth, a ghost story whispered around far-off campfires, the branded man and the Indian witch who had vanished into the hills. One evening, sitting outside their home, they watched the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. Isaac, who now knew their Cheyenne names, pointed them out to her. "That one," he said, his arm around her shoulder, "is the home of the spirits." Winona leaned her head against him, a feeling of profound peace settling over her. She looked at the scarred man beside her, the man her world was supposed to hate and his was supposed to despise. They were an impossible pairing, an affront to the cruel logic of the world beyond their hills. But here, together, under the vast, silent watch of the stars, they made perfect sense. She no longer needed the beaded pouch to find her way. She was already home.